In a tomb 5 kilometers south of Jerusalem, archaeologists found an ossuary. On it, carved in Hebrew 2,000 years ago, 5 words: Judah, son of Jesus. 5 words on a stone box, in a family tomb, next to another ossuary that reads, Jesus, son of Joseph. Nobody told you about this. Nobody put it in a Sunday school lesson. Nobody mentioned it from a pulpit. And when a documentary aired it on the Discovery Channel in 2007, the reaction from the church wasn't curiosity, it was panic. You're at home. Maybe it's a rainy Saturday. Maybe it's a weeknight after the house has gone quiet. You're doing what 40 million Americans did last year. You're tracing your family tree. Maybe you got one of those DNA kits for Christmas. Maybe you found your grandmother's name on a census record from 1910. Either way, you're pulling at a thread, going back, generation by generation. 4, 5, 6, if you're lucky. Names turning into dates, turning into places, turning into silence. And then a thought crosses your mind. The kind that seems too simple to be important. Jesus lived 2,000 years ago. 2 billion people follow him. Everyone knows his mother, his father, his 12 closest friends. You can name the town where he was born and the hill where he died. But nobody tells you what happened to his family after the cross. Not the next generation. Not the one after that. The most discussed man in human history has no family tree after Golgotha. You've always assumed there wasn't one. That he lived alone, died alone, left no children, left no lineage. But what if that's not true? What if there was a family tree? And what if the reason you've never heard about it is that someone made sure you wouldn't? My name is Nathan. By now some of you know me. Former history teacher, 12 years at a Catholic school in Indiana. Resigned when the questions I kept asking became more than the institution could tolerate. This investigation started at my kitchen table. My daughter was in 10th grade. She had a genealogy project for her social studies class. She'd mapped our family back 5 generations. The Blanchards, the Kowalskis, the Millers, names on census forms, addresses in small Indiana towns that don't exist anymore. She was proud of it. She had this big chart spread out on the table with arrows and dates and little photographs she'd printed from old records. And then she looked up at me and said, "Dad, does Jesus have a family tree?" I said, "What you'd expect a former Catholic school teacher to say." I said, "Jesus dedicated his life to his mission. He didn't marry. He didn't have children." She nodded, went back to her chart. But that night I couldn't sleep, not because the question was new, because I realized I'd never actually examined the answer. I'd just repeated it, the way you repeat anything you've been told enough times. So I opened my Bible to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 5, a verse I'd read before and never thought twice about. Paul writes, "Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas, the brothers of the Lord, James, Jude, the men the Bible itself calls Jesus' brothers?" Paul says, plainly and without controversy, that they traveled with their wives. Jesus' own brothers were married men. Every one of them. Paul doesn't explain it or defend it, he mentions it the way you'd mention the weather. It was that obvious. And if every brother of Jesus was married, and every apostle was married, and Peter himself was married, then the assumption that Jesus was the one exception to the most fundamental obligation in first-century Jewish culture starts to feel less like history and more like a decision someone made later. And here's where it gets interesting. In first-century Judaism, marriage was not a lifestyle choice, it was a religious obligation. The Talmud records that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, writing at the end of the 1st century, said that a man who does not engage in procreation is as though he has committed murder. Murder. Not a minor failing, not a regrettable choice, the moral equivalent of taking a life. Every Jewish male was expected to marry, typically in his late teens or early 20s. If you were a rabbi, a teacher, a man who spoke in synagogues, marriage was assumed. Not optional, not debatable, not something you had to explain. Were there exceptions? Yes. The Essenes lived in desert communities and some practiced celibacy. Paul himself was unmarried, but the exceptions were so unusual that ancient writers specifically noted them. Philo wrote about the Essenes' rejection of marriage as something remarkable. Paul defended his own celibacy in his letters. These men stood out precisely because they broke the norm. Nobody in any first-century text explains why Jesus was unmarried. Nobody defends it. Nobody even mentions it. In a culture where celibacy required an explanation, Jesus' marital status receives no explanation at all. That silence has two possible meanings. Either nobody thought it was worth mentioning because he followed the norm, or somebody erased the record later because it contradicted the theology they were building. Now open the Gospel of Philip. This is one of the texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945. In it, Mary Magdalene is called Jesus's koinonos. That's a Greek word that gets translated as companion in most English editions. But here's what most people don't know. The word koinonos appears in the Old Testament, in Malachi chapter 2, verse 14. And there, it doesn't mean companion, it means wife, the wife of your covenant, the partner in your marriage. The same word, the same language, used in the Hebrew scriptures to describe a wife in a marriage covenant, used in the Gospel of Philip to describe Mary Magdalene's relationship to Jesus. The text also says Jesus used to kiss her often. And here's where the evidence turns into a mystery. The papyrus is physically damaged at exactly the word that would tell us where he kissed her. On her mouth, on her forehead, on her hand. We'll never know. The one word that would settle the question is a hole in 2,000-year-old paper. I'm not saying this proves they were married. I'm saying the evidence is more complicated than anyone standing behind a pulpit ever told you. Close your eyes for a moment. Not literally, but go back 2,000 years. You're in a small stone house in Galilee. The walls are thick and cool. There's a fire in the courtyard. The smell of bread baking on hot stones. Children running between the doorways. A man sits at a wooden table. He's been teaching in the synagogue all day. His hands are rough from years of carpentry before that. His wife brings water. His daughter climbs into his lap. In the culture he was born into, this would have been the most ordinary scene imaginable. Every rabbi had a home like this. Every teacher had children pulling at his sleeve. Every man who walked with God was expected to walk with a family first. You were taught that Jesus was the exception, that he transcended the ordinary, that he walked above the world, not through it. But what if the most radical thing about him was the opposite? What if the hidden truth isn't that he was divine and therefore alone, but that he was fully, completely human? And what if the institution that claimed to represent him couldn't allow that? Now let me show you what the Church's own historians recorded. This is where the story moves from theological debate into something that feels like a cover-up. A man named Hegesippus, writing sometime between 150 and 180 AD, compiled a history of the early Church. His original work didn't survive, but large portions were preserved word for word by Eusebius, the most important church historian who ever lived, in his ecclesiastical history. In Book 3, Chapter 20, Eusebius quotes Hegesippus describing something I still can't believe doesn't get more attention. Emperor Domitian, who ruled Rome from 81 to 96 AD, ordered the arrest and interrogation of certain men. These men were not criminals, they were not rebels, they were farmers from Galilee, and they were brought before the Emperor of Rome for one reason. They were the grandsons of Jude, the brother of Jesus. Let me say that again. The Roman emperor personally arrested and interrogated the grandchildren of Jesus' own brother. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is in Eusebius, the Church's own canonical historian, the man Constantine trusted to write the official version. Domitian wanted to know if they were descendants of David. They said yes. He asked about their property and wealth. They said they owned about 39 plethora of land, roughly 9,000 denarii between them, on which they paid taxes and lived by their own labor. And then, according to Hegesippus, they showed him their hands, calloused, cracked, stained with soil, the hands of men who worked the earth every day of their lives. Domitian looked at those hands, looked at those men, and he laughed. Too poor, too insignificant, not a threat to the empire. He sent them home. But listen to what happened next. Hegesippus writes, when they were released, they became leaders of the churches, as was natural in the case of those who were at once martyrs and of the kindred of the Lord. Leaders of the churches. Not because of their theology, not because of their training, not because they passed an examination or received an ordination, because of their blood, because they were kindred of the Lord. Another early historian, Julius Africanus, writing around 160 to 240 AD, recorded something just as significant. He described a group called the Desposyni. The word comes from the Greek desposynoi, meaning belonging to the master. These were the blood relatives of Jesus, and they kept private genealogical records, family trees, tracing their lineage through Jesus's family, back to David, back through the centuries. Africanus, as preserved in Eusebius's History, Book 1, Chapter 7, writes that they came from two specific villages, Nazara and Kulchaba, and they, in his words, pride themselves in preserving the memory of their noble descent. They had a family tree. They kept it, they were proud of it, and for centuries they led churches because of it. Picture this: Rome, sometime around 90 AD, the imperial palace, marble floors so polished you can see your face in them, guards at every doorway, and on a raised throne sits the emperor of the known world. Two men stand before him. They are not soldiers, they are not senators. They are farmers from a village so small it barely appears on Roman maps. Their robes are patched, their sandals are cracked and worn through. The dust of Galilee is still in the lines of their faces. The emperor leans forward. "Are you the family of the Christ?" They don't flinch. "Yes." He asks what they own, a small piece of land. They work it themselves. They pay their taxes. "Show me your hands." They hold them out, palms up, lines deep as plowed furrows, calluses thick as leather, the hands of men who've never held a sword or counted gold. Domitian stares at those hands for a long moment, and then he waves them away. Beneath his concern, two farmers from nowhere, not worth the trouble. They walk out of the palace alive. They go home, and they lead churches, because the blood of Jesus's family runs in their veins, and in the 1st century, everybody knew it. Now, in 1980, a construction crew in the East Talpiot neighborhood of Jerusalem, about 5 kilometers south of the Old City, uncovered a rock-cut tomb. Inside were 10 ossuaries, stone bone boxes, the standard burial practice for 1st century Jews. 6 had inscriptions carved into them. Here are the names, exactly as they were catalogued by Amos Kloner of the Israel Antiquities Authority, published in the journal Attikot in 1996. Yeshua bar Yehoseph, Jesus, son of Joseph. Maria, Mary, Yose, a diminutive of Joseph, the same rare form that Mark's Gospel uses for one of Jesus's brothers, Matthew, Maria Mene Imara, written in Greek, a form of Mary followed by the title Mara, meaning master or teacher, and the 6th, Yehuda bar Yeshua, Judah, son of Jesus, a family tomb, with a Jesus, a Mary, a Joseph, a Matthew, and someone called the son of Jesus, all within walking distance of the city where Jesus was crucified. In 2007, filmmaker Simcha Jacobovici and producer James Cameron made a Discovery Channel documentary about the find. They hired Andre Feuerwerger, a statistician at the University of Toronto, to calculate the probability of this specific combination of names appearing together in one tomb by chance. His result? 600 to 1 against. They also tested DNA extracted from residue inside the Jesus and Maria Mene ossuaries. Mitochondrial analysis showed they were not maternally related, not mother and son, not siblings. In a family tomb, where people are buried alongside blood relatives, two unrelated individuals of opposite sex typically indicates one relationship. Marriage. I'm still not sure about this part, and I want to be honest with you about the objections, because they deserve serious attention. Amos Kloner, the archaeologist who first examined the tomb, said the names found on the ossuaries were extremely common in 1st century Jerusalem. Jesus, Mary, Joseph. These are among the most frequently inscribed names from that entire period. François Bovon at Harvard Divinity School, whose scholarship on the Acts of Philip was used to connect Maria Mene to Mary Magdalene, later said plainly, "I do not believe that Mariamne is the real name of the historical Mary Magdalene." Hegesippus, one of the world's leading Dead Sea Scrolls scholars at Oxford, stated that the Magdalene identification had, in his words, no support whatever, and that without it, the entire case collapses. So I'm not going to tell you this tomb proves Jesus had a son named Judah. The evidence is not strong enough for that claim. But I will tell you this: An ossuary exists, right now, in a warehouse in Israel, with the words Judah, son of Jesus carved into it 2,000 years ago. And the fact that we can't prove it refers to the Jesus doesn't mean we can prove it doesn't. The tomb asks a question, and nobody has closed it. The ossuary isn't the only thread. There's another one 3,000 miles from Jerusalem, in southern France. In a region called the Camargue, there's a small coastal town named Sainte-Marie de la Mer, the Saints Marys of the Sea. According to medieval Provençal tradition, after the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene, Martha, Lazarus, and several companions were set adrift in a boat with no sails and no oars, and they landed here. The tradition includes a child, a girl, named Sarah. In Hebrew, Sarah means princess. Margaret Starbird, a Catholic scholar who studied at the University of Maryland, published a book in 1993 called The Woman with the Alabaster Jar. She proposed that Sarah was the daughter of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, that the anointing of Jesus at Bethany, described in the Gospels, was a hieros gamos, a sacred marriage rite from the ancient Near East, in which the royal bride confers kingship on the bridegroom by anointing him with oil. The tradition says Mary Magdalene arrived in Gaul around 42 AD. If Jesus was crucified around 33 AD and Sarah was 12 when she arrived, the timeline fits. A princess, the daughter of a king, arriving on the shores of France. And there is physical evidence in France too. In the Basilica of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume in Provence, there is a golden reliquary. Inside it is a blackened skull. Since 1279, when Charles II of Salerno ordered excavations beneath the basilica and discovered a crypt with a wax tablet reading Hic requiescit corpus Beatae Mariae Magdalenae. Here rests the body of the Blessed Mary Magdalene. This skull has been venerated as hers. In 1974, the CNRS, the French National Center for Scientific Research, performed an anthropological analysis. Their finding? A Mediterranean woman, approximately 50 years old, small stature. And in 2017, Philippe Charlier at the University of Versailles led a team that created a full computer-aided facial reconstruction of the skull using photogrammetry and scanning electron microscopy. High cheekbones, pointed nose, round face. Their results were published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2019. I'm not asking you to believe that skull belongs to Mary Magdalene, but someone in 13th century France cared enough to preserve it. Someone believed it was hers, and someone built a basilica around it. Every year in May, in Sainte-Marie de la Mer, something happens that the Catholic Church has never endorsed and cannot explain. Thousands of people gather, many of them Romani coming from across Europe. Some walk for days. Some have been making this pilgrimage their entire lives, as their parents did, and their grandparents before them. They enter the church, they descend into the crypt, and they lift a statue of a dark-skinned girl onto their shoulders. They carry her through the narrow streets, past the white-walled houses, past the fishing boats resting on sand, all the way to the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. The statue touches the water. The crowd sings. The Catholic Church does not recognize Sarah as a saint. They have never officially explained who she was. The Romani people call her Sara la Kali, Black Sarah. Nobody in that crowd needs the church's permission. They carry her to the sea every year, to the exact spot where tradition says she arrived, with Mary Magdalene, nearly 2,000 years ago, a girl named Princess, arriving from Palestine. And the church says nothing. Here's where the trail goes cold. According to Malachi Martin, an Irish Jesuit priest who published The Decline and Fall of the Roman Church, something happened in 318 AD that has no parallel in the history of Christianity. A group of men traveled to Rome. They requested an audience with Pope Sylvester I. They identified themselves as the Desposyni, the blood family of Jesus, and they made 3 demands. First, replace the Greek bishops in Jerusalem, Antioch, Ephesus, and Alexandria with bishops from their family line. Second, resume the ancient practice of sending financial support to Jerusalem as the mother church of all Christianity. Third, restore the observance of Jewish law, the Sabbath, the feast days. The practices Jesus himself followed. Sylvester refused. All three. He declared Rome the mother church. He told them to accept the bishops appointed by Rome, or leave. After that meeting, the Desposyni disappear from history. Completely. No more genealogies, no more church leadership based on bloodline, no more calloused hands held up before emperors. Silence. Now I have to be honest. Martin did not provide a primary source for this meeting. His account is unverified. But the pattern matches everything else. For 300 years, Jesus' blood family held a recognized place in the early church. Church historians wrote about them openly. And then Rome consolidated power and the family vanished. The sensitivity around this question hasn't faded, not even slightly. In September of 2012, Karen King, one of the most respected scholars at Harvard Divinity School, presented a papyrus fragment at an academic conference in Rome. On it were the words, "Jesus said to them, 'My wife.'" The academic world erupted. The Vatican called it a likely forgery almost immediately. Testing at Harvard in 2014 seemed to authenticate the ink and the papyrus. And then Ariel Sabar, a journalist at The Atlantic, published a devastating investigation in June of 2016. The papyrus was a forgery, created by a man named Walter Fritz, a German-born former Egyptology student at the Free University of Berlin, who had dropped out after accusations of intellectual plagiarism. He'd later become an auto parts dealer in Florida. The forgery was caught because Fritz had copied text from a 2002 PDF of Michael Grondin's interlinear translation of the Gospel of Thomas. He reproduced a typographical error from the digital file. A typo in a PDF undid the most explosive biblical discovery in decades. King herself eventually conceded. It appears now that all the material Fritz gave to me concerning the provenance of the papyrus were fabrications. A soldier, fooling Harvard for 4 years, over the question of whether Jesus had a wife. That's how sensitive this is. Not ancient history. Not a settled debate from centuries ago. This is happening now. In academic offices and Vatican corridors. The question of whether Jesus had a family still terrifies people who hold power. J.J. Benítez spent over 40 years investigating the historical Jesus. He traveled to Israel more than 15 times. In his Caballo de Troya series, which sold over 15 million copies across 12 books, he reconstructed Jesus' daily life in extraordinary detail. He presented Jesus with 8 biological siblings. He depicted a man who lost his father to a construction accident at age 14 and became the head of the household overnight. A man who worked with his hands, who raised his younger brothers and sisters, who lived a fully human life before he ever preached a single word. Even Benítez, who went further than almost anyone in portraying Jesus as a complete human being, drew the line at claiming marriage or descendants. But the framework he spent 4 decades building points in a direction he chose not to follow. If Jesus had 8 siblings, if his brothers traveled with their wives, if the culture he lived in treated marriage as a sacred obligation, punishable by divine comparison to murder, then the assumption that he was the sole exception becomes harder to sustain with every piece of evidence. Maybe what Benítez uncovered about the human Jesus was only the beginning. Maybe the family was always there, recorded by the church's own historians, preserved in a French legend, carved into a stone box in Jerusalem, and erased, not because it didn't exist, but because a human Jesus with a human family threatened the very foundation of the institution built in his name. You close your laptop, or your phone, or whatever you've been holding. The family tree you spent your Saturday building goes back 5 generations. Faces you half remember from photographs. Names you've heard at holiday dinners. The further back you go, the thinner the thread gets. Eventually, it disappears into silence. His thread goes back 2,000 years, and the silence at the end of it isn't natural. It was engineered. Church historians recorded the family. They wrote it down. Names, villages, genealogies, calloused hands held out before an emperor, leaders of churches chosen not for what they believed, but for the blood running through their veins. And then someone decided that a human Jesus, a married Jesus, a Jesus with children, was too dangerous for the institution they were building. So they didn't just suppress the answer. They erased the question. They made it so that even asking, "Did Jesus have a family?" felt like blasphemy. It was never blasphemy. It was the most human question you could ask about the most human man who ever lived. An ossuary in Jerusalem. A girl named Princess carried to the sea every May in France. Calloused hands held up in a Roman palace. A pope who turned away the last known relatives. And a forger in Florida who proved by his desperation to fake the answer that the question itself still terrifies the people who hold power. You don't have to believe all of it. I don't believe all of it. Some of these threads are strong. Some are fragile. Some may lead nowhere. But the question is real. The evidence is real, and they spent 2,000 years making sure you would never ask it. Now you have.